433-9614 to see if your hard-earned wealth is being properly cared for. That number again is 352-433-9614 or email Brandon at ourfamilyfinancial.com.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 25 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. This is not to rub salt in an old wound, but yesterday was Constitution Day, and one of the things that is so profound and important to remember about the Constitution is that it declares that all men are created equal. And yet, it took a very, very long time for us to really, really, really try to adhere to that very notion, that idea. The next book we're going to talk about is titled Unpunished Murder, Massacre at Colfax and the Quest for Justice. It is such a well-written book by our guest, Lawrence Goldstone. Let me just read to you the first paragraph of what the description is on the Amazon page. On Easter Sunday of 1873, just 8 years after the Civil War ended, a band of white supremacists marched into Grand Parish, Louisiana, and massacred over 100 unarmed African Americans. The court case that followed reached the highest court in the land, yet following one of the most ghastly incidents of mass murder in American history, not one person was convicted. And again, not to rub salt in an old wound, but it is important to remember that we've had a lot of growing pains from the ideal that we are all created equal to actually recognizing that that truth is a truth. Lawrence Goldstone, this is a story I had never heard, although it probably shouldn't be surprising to me, this very story. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning. How are you, Larry? Many law students haven't heard of it either, so you're in good company.
Where are you? Where are you calling from?
I am in the Hamptons in eastern Long Island in New York.
Okay, yeah, I know exactly where that is. I grew up on Long Island. So one of the north-south thing that still exists today, because I'm in the South, obviously, although Florida sometimes gets excluded from these conversations. But I think sometimes we think that this stuff didn't happen in the North, or that it still happens in the South, and I think both things are untrue.
Well, this particular sort of incident happened. Nothing like this happened in the North. I mean, this was an incident where white supremacist invaders intentionally rode into a town with the express purpose of murdering as many African American defenders as they could, and they did. Yeah. But it is also true that racism in the North during this period was largely responsible for what was a very weak response by especially the Supreme Court. And in fact, the decision that they handed down set in motion a series of decisions that brought into being the Jim Crow laws, which enslaved millions of African Americans for a century in all but name, and would also with the acquiescence of many white people in the North. So you're right. I mean, this is a national issue. This is not something that you can focus in on one section of the country or another.
Yeah, if it was,
and the Supreme Court justices were all from the North as well. So.
Absolutely, and that's exactly. Thank you for saying it that way. The case was called U.S. versus, what was it called again?
United States v. Cruikshank, because what happened was the 150 invaders were not going to be punished by Louisiana. So the federal government indicted 98 of them, were charged with violating the right of equal free assembly of the African Americans in the town. Only 3 were convicted. One of them was named Cruikshank, and they appealed to the Supreme Court. And the convictions were overturned, and everything kind of roll downhill from there.
Oh my gosh, it's just hard to imagine. But the good news is we're not doing that anymore. We're not there anymore. I think that's the good news, unless you disagree with that.
Well, we're not. We're certainly not there in this regard, but we're also not at a place where we recognize we don't recognize the power of the Supreme Court. We don't recognize the significance of what they do, the long-term effects, and we don't recognize, I don't think, that equal justice is not something that comes easily. Equal justice has to be worked for. It's not the given state of things. You have to be committed to equal justice in order to get it. And I don't know that we as a country have fully grasped that truth yet.
That sounds debatable. So how did this story make its way to you? How did you find this story, and how did you start digging into it to get to all the facts in it?
Well, I've written 3 books on constitutional law for adults, and one of them was on the civil rights decisions of the Supreme Court after the Civil War. And I got going on that because I was interested in the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, the separate but equal case. And what I discovered was that the genesis of that case came before, and I kept moving backwards, and I came across United States v. Cruikshank, and I realized just how significant it was, both in terms of the decision itself and the legal philosophy under which the decision was rendered, which was very similar. It was done as a strict construction, textualist decision. So I realized that is something that not only had import at the time and certainly had effect rolling downhill, but also is a mirror to how we deal with the law today. And I thought that this is something, these sorts of stories should definitely be available to students and their parents. Yeah. And I'm hoping this will get people thinking and talking on both sides of the spectrum. Not aimed at one side.
Absolutely agree with you. I think here's the sad part about this, and then the good part is you, actually, and people like you who write these books, because the sad part is the what do they say? The history is written by the victors. Whatever. What is the saying? History.
Yes.
Okay. So in this case, I mean, the poor people who are dead and their families, they don't. There's no way that they're ever going to be able to tell this story. So we need somebody to do it. And even if it does take 100-something years to tell it, at least somebody like yourself finds out about it, because you know what? We become a better nation when we learn about the mistakes of our past.
Boy, that is so right. And we become a stronger nation, and the corollary, obviously, is that we are a weaker nation when we don't.
Yeah.
You know, Larry, the idea, democracy is an unforgiving system. If you don't get involved, the other guy gets to make the decisions.
I love that.
And one of the things I'm really trying to do is to get students who are traditionally one of the lowest voter turnout demographics, to get students and get their parents to recognize how important it is to participate in the system. And you can't complain about it if you're sitting home and doing nothing. So what I want to do is to say, this is the history, this is the significance, this is how the court works, and this is how justices think. And if you want to have an impact on that, you must be involved yourself.
Were the Supreme Court justices back then like the Supreme Court justices of today, where they were being chosen with how many liberals and how many conservatives, or were they just chosen as people on their own merit, to be fair, all the way around?
By and large, they were chosen for points of view. It wasn't as extreme as it is today, Robin, but the point of view, the court had started moving in the direction of appointing lawyers, because very few of them had been judges first, appointing lawyers who had done corporate law, because this is the rise of the corporation. So you had of the philosophy of business which exploded in the wake of the Civil War, that business, that corporations, railroads particularly, many of the justices who were appointed in the 1870s and 1880s had backgrounds in railroad law. So it was more that these were considered to be the people who needed to be making judgments on constitutional issues rather than liberal or conservative, because that did not break down the way we do it today.
The book, again, if you're just tuning in, is called Unpunished Murder. I'll ask our guest Lawrence to retell the little bit that I told, and then, of course, elaborate even more. Massacre at Colfax and the Quest for Justice. Lawrence Goldstone is our guest. He's the author. I wanted to tell you something and then ask you to kind of recap for the audience what they may have missed if they just tuned in. We have a town not too far from here. Robert, what is that town called near Cedar Cape? Rosewood. They made a movie about a similar incident in a town around here. I don't think there were quite 100 people that were massacred, but have you ever heard of Rosewood?
Oh, absolutely. And there were a number. There was a horrific incident in Tulsa. There was a massacre in New Orleans, in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. So, yeah, I have definitely heard of Rosewood. The Colfax massacre is not unique as an incident. What made it unique was the Supreme Court decision that sprung from it, because that's the only one of these cases that ultimately became part of the law, of the supreme law of the land.
So that being the supreme law of the land, does it influence? Oh gosh, people who don't want to do the right thing. Let me put it that way. Does it justify people who don't want to do the right thing, whether they're in the North or the South? Does that happen?
Well, yes. I mean, in the broadest sense, the Supreme Court, people tend to use, and I'm back to participating in the democracy. People tend to use the law to serve their interests, no matter what. Yeah. This is a human phenomenon. And so if the law is either drawn or adjudicated in such a way as to allow them to do something that most of us would find particularly unpleasant, then yes, people of bad will or people who have their own agendas will say, well, it's the law. After World War II, the Nuremberg, I was only following orders. So people will look for justification in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of places. So what we have to do, or what we should do as a nation which values freedom and values equal justice, is to try to make sure that there's that there's not so many places to hide if you want to do it, and to try to draw the law, because the law is not just language. The Constitution was an attempt to establish equal and fundamental justice for all people. Probably the first time in history that any societies actually tried to do that. And so we need to keep to that ideal.
Would this racial divide have been less if the Constitution would have been worded differently?
Ooh, that is a really good question, Robin.
Yes, sure is.
I did a book called Dark Bargain, which examines slave economics at the Constitutional Convention and how they simply the South would not have joined a union in 1787 that did not protect slavery. So all sorts of things, not just the 3/5 clause, the census was based on slave economics, how often it was taken. So if we had dealt with the issue back then in 1787, we would not have had a country. Now, ultimately, if you had two countries that were split, would they have gotten together? I don't know.
Hard to know. Yeah.
The racial divide is so deep and so fundamental that it's hard to imagine it not existing simply because certain other accommodations were or were not made.
At the risk of it sounding like I'm asking you to be a teacher, could you tell us what the 3/5 clause is? I think I know, and I'm hoping that most of our audience does. But for those, and it's an absolute sin, really, right? That we were counting people as not whole people.
Yeah.
If I remember right.
Well. It's actually, in short, it meant that for apportionment, to decide how many seats a state would get in the House of Representatives and how many presidential electors, slaves were counted as 3 people for every 5 that existed. And there was another compromise about taxation. But what's interesting is, in order to pass this, in order to agree to the 3/5 clause, remember, the Southerners, slave owners, were insisting that slaves were property. But for this, they had to say, well, slaves are people, because you're counting 3 of them for every 5. The Northerners were insisting that slaves were people, but to try to deny them being included in apportionment, they had to say, no, they're property. So you had a compromise that required each side to take exactly the opposite position that they had going into the Constitutional Convention, which is kind of interesting. People don't write about that either.
Is it fair to say that that statement is true in 1870, but not necessarily in 1770? Well, in 1770, wasn't the North just as guilty of slavery as the South?
In 1787, no, it wasn't. There was definitely slavery in the North at the Constitutional Convention, but a number of states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, had outlawed it. New York still technically had slavery, but it was disappearing. Southern Pennsylvania, the Southern economy. In fact, there were 2 Southern economies. There was Virginia, which grew tobacco, which was which was kind of a nice, forgiving climate. So the number of slaves multiplied radically. And then South Carolina, which grew rice, where slave mortality was very high. The North made its money by shipping, to Africa, or shipping goods back and forth that were based on the slave system. So you had these 3 economies. It was kind of a rock, paper, scissors situation. But the northern economy, in many ways, profited from slavery, but slavery was not anywhere near as pervasive in the North as it was in the South. The entire social system was based on slavery in the South.
Did any of the family members of those who were murdered in Colfax, did they write about it? And is there any written history that you were able to draw from?
Wow, that's a great question. Not that I know of. There's a ton of history. There are newspaper accounts. There are interviews when the Army finally got to Colfax, which wasn't until days later. They interviewed a number of people. But as far as, and some of the survivors testified at great risk to themselves because they were almost certainly going to be murdered. It turns out they weren't, but they thought they would be, testified at the trial. But in terms of the survivors' relatives, nothing that I saw.
Are you familiar with the song by Randy Newman, Rednecks? Are you familiar with that song?
Some, yeah.
Okay, and in that song, of course, there's a large part of the song I could not recite on the air. Mm-hmm. But one of the things he says, and I looked up the lyrics so I could be accurate with it. He says, the North has set the Negro free. And then he goes on to say, yes, he's free to be put in a cage in Harlem in New York City, and he's free to be put in a cage in the south side of Chicago and the west side, and he's free to be put in a cage in Huff and Cleveland. I don't know if I said that right. And he's free to be put in a cage in East St. Louis. And he goes on and on and on. And I remember living in New York, hearing the story about the bridges that go out to Long Island that were not made tall enough for the buses, so that people who needed buses couldn't get to the beaches, and that was
Robert Moses.
Robert Moses,
exactly right. These beautiful parkways.
Yeah,
they kept the overpass low enough so they couldn't, so buses, so black people couldn't get to. Absolutely true.
Yeah, and so while Supreme Court rulings and laws are in place, there is still this underhanded thing, like the real estate purchases. I grew up in Merrick, which was pretty much all white. In fact, I don't think it was anything but white. And right next door, Freeport, pretty much all black. I don't know how that happens unless it's not real estate agents being told, hey, this is what you got to do. Somebody's putting pressure on them, right?
If you are saying that the North sits back and smugly blames the South for sins that they themselves are committing, I could not agree with you more. And that's exactly, this is, and the big issue here is that we are taking a national problem and making it a sectional problem. And I said, you thanked me, every one of those justices that ruled in Crookshank was all the people voting to free the to free the murderers were Northerners, and the one dissenter, the brilliant dissent that lives with us today, was John Marshall Harlan, a Kentucky former slave owner himself and the son of slave owners.
Oh, wow.
So to make this, and everybody out there, go and read Harlan's dissent, because in Plessy he said the Constitution is colorblind, which is a different dissent, also an 8-1
There you
decision.
go. There you go.
So
There's always a rose, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can't. If what you're saying is that there's a good deal of Northern hypocrisy about racism, I'm right with you. This is a national problem, and it's one that all of us need to confront. And I wrote the book not just for the South. I'm hoping to start conversations everywhere for people to come to terms with what is a very important key national issue, because how we deal with our populations, our various populations, will determine how successful we are as a democracy.
And this book should be required reading for all history classes, I think.
Yeah, this message. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to tell you a story. We had a man in the studio, and he's probably about our age, I guess, 50-ish or so. And Robin and I, 64, so he looked more like 50-ish. But anyway, he's a really great, talented singer, and he was performing at the local Hilton. He happens to be a black man. And he posted on Facebook. He said he had posted something about a racist, and he said he was in, I think it was in the Ocala National Forest, which is known, whether it's fair or not, it's known as a redneck area. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he was standing behind some guy, a white guy who he described as looking like a redneck. He said he had all the telltale signs of one of those guys with the beer and the way he talked and everything. And then here comes a little black girl, and she hugs his legs, and she says, "Daddy, can I get a candy bar?" And the guy said, oh my gosh, maybe I'm being the racist.
Yeah.
And then here comes his wife, and his wife was a beautiful black lady, and the guy's, oh my gosh. He realized he himself was being sucked into that same thing. The guy's a really sweet guy, by the way. We know him.
Wonderful.
And just so you know, Lawrence, Robin and I do this show from a mall. And you know what the positive thing, the optimism comes from? You look out at the young people walking into the mall. They're holding hands, and they're black and white. The Martin Luther King's dream is coming true.
Exactly.
My daughter's generation, my daughter's 27, my daughter's generation, it isn't just that she ignores color. I'm not even sure she sees it.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right.
And this is so right. The biggest problem with what's going on in the country now is that we don't talk to each other, because people, I try to talk to people whose points of view are totally different than mine. That's how you learn. I already know what I think.
There you go.
So if you can get people, and the biggest harm that is being done, and this is both sides of the political spectrum, is this hardening where we're right or we're all right, you're all wrong. Nobody says on either side, well, I have to say they have a point.
That's right.
And that's what we need to do.
That's right. And every Thanksgiving, I'm with family, and they're all smart. And guess what? We don't all agree. But they're smart. So this must be something that we need to listen to on each side.
That is, I could not agree more.
Have your attorney friends read the book and given their input on this?
I definitely have a cadre of lawyers, but if you don't do constitutional law, you've never heard of it. I am serious. I get emails from law school professors that say, God, I've been trying to get my students to read about this case, and constitutional law professors, they know about it. And some of them, every constitutional law professor, if they admit it or not, will know the significance of United States v. Cruikshank. And many of them will slough over it, and some of them will say, yes, it's important. There are any number of articles written on the case and how important it is. And then there's a lot of people who say, well, it's just an exception. No, it isn't. So, again... Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Lawrence. This is an important topic. You do it. You tell it so well. It's important to remember there weren't isolated incidents like the one around the corner here, and I can't remember the name of the town. What was that town again, Robin, in Cedar Key? Rosewood, thank you. You know better than I do, Lawrence. It's an important topic, and I do think we're seeing the results. I also think, by the way, that the news media focuses on the exceptions instead of the rule. I know there are exceptions out there, but I think the rule is that pretty much we're all getting along, and it's a shame that the news doesn't reflect that. Your book.
We are getting along. I don't know, but we are certainly getting along more than the news media would portray.
Right.
But look, they're about selling, and I will say, Larry, that's never changed. If you go back and read the newspapers from the time I read the newspapers, exactly the same stuff.
Really?
Just exactly the same. You have to read both sides if you want to get if you don't want to get a filter.
This book is currently number 36, and it only came out last week. So good for you. That's awesome. I don't see that very often. And let's see, I found it on Amazon. I was sent a copy of the book. So if I have somebody out there who would like it, please call me, and I will leave it here for you. The rest of us have to go buy it. Lawrence Goldstone is who you're looking for. Unpunished Murder is the title of the book, and getting good reviews on Amazon. Do you have a website you want to share with us?
I do. It's www.lawrencegoldstone.com. You can go and find out all about me if you're interested. And there's an email if you have anybody has any questions.
Okay, real quickly, let me give the book away before I say goodbye. Good morning. You've got the book. Who's this? Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, you've got the book. Who's this?
Edwina.
Edwina, the book will be waiting for you, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Boy, that one quick. The phone was lit up on that one, by the way, just so you know. Lawrence Goldstone, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today, and thank you for the work you do. You're making the world a better place with books like this.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. All right, we'll take a little break. Be right back.
Keep up with what's going on in the downtown area with Ocala Downtown Newspaper. Delivering thousands of newspapers to businesses in the downtown area, Ocala Downtown is there to keep you informed. They even have Tom's Picks, a free referral for people who are looking for a company to do work for them. Tom's Picks will refer the company that fits your needs, and all we ask in return is that you tell them where you heard about it. It's simple. For more info, just call Tom's Picks, 352-804-1223, and pick up your copy of the Downtown Ocala newspaper today.
And now read Ocala Downtown Newspaper online. Are you being overcharged for investment advice? Brandon White with Our Family Financial is not like any other financial advisors. He keeps fees low and your needs